Couple more people coming in. Okay. I want to welcome everyone to the April meeting of SAAA. For the folks who are joining us for the first time, we are recording the meeting and it will be on YouTube in a day or so. So if you missed part of it or somebody else missed it, you may want to direct it. You can get to that YouTube either through YouTube or you can go to our website and you can get a direct link to it. As most of us know, March is over and March is Archaeology Month. And I just wanted to thank all the people who renewed their membership. We had a very good membership drive this go round. For those of you who are not familiar with SAAA, let me just give you a little history. Let me let somebody in here first before we do that. Okay, we're in good shape. SAAA has been around about 35 years, and it was established initially to assist the city archaeology program, which it's still doing right now. I don't know if you know it, but some of the tasks that we do, there's properties that are in the city limits that SAAA is a stewardship of. They've been doing it for years. And recently the city asked us to do the same for some sites out in Fish Island. There's 7 sites that we'll be monitoring. What else do we do? Well, you know, we have these monthly meetings. We run them through the year except for the summer. Normally, for the folks who don't realize it, we normally have it at Flagler College. There's a newsletter that goes out on a quarterly basis. And we do put historic markers around the city. There's any number of them that we put out. In fact, we're looking to put out a couple more. We have the funding for 2. So if anybody has any ideas, just let us know and we'll look into it. There's also a number of member-only events that we normally run through the year. But with the pandemic, that slowed us down a little bit. But I'm sure in the fall, we're planning on doing another one. And of course, most of us remember that we do run the best Christmas party in St. Augustine. And these are member-only events. The membership is relatively low. It's $5 for a student, 15 for an individual, and 20 for a family. And you can go to our website, which is saaa.shutterfly.com, and you can join, you can renew your membership online with the Squares program, or you can simply write a check and send it to our post office box, which is P.O. Box 1301, and that's St. Augustine 32085. One of the other things that we've instituted recently, and we're just getting started, is the educational fund. And I see Nick is on. Nick, can you fill us in on what's going on there?
Sure can. We've had a really good start with this fund as far as getting going with publicity and getting the word out to at least our membership. And we've also shared it with Historical Society and a number of other groups around that we are getting going with this fund. It's been decided that we're going to name it after Eugene Lyon, a well-known historian and a friend of archaeology, one of the early members of the SAAA, and actually was on our board for a number of years back in the early days of the group. And he seemed to be a very appropriate person. He just passed away not long ago, a very appropriate person for us to name an education fund after. And the idea is to just raise as much money as we can so that we can give it out to terribly worthy students around who might need some assistance in something relating to their education. And we aren't limiting it to either graduate students or undergraduates or whatever, something relating to anthropology and archaeology. And we expect to be on a timetable so that in the fall we can begin to make our first awards. We have some work to do as a committee to come up with our details of our forms and write-ups and that sort of thing, and evaluating. So we have some things to work on, but basically things are going along very well. The SAAA kicked it off with a donation of $500, and since then we've had 20 members, 20-member households who have donated additional funds, and we're up over $1,200 total, including that 500. We're around 1,250 now, so we're very pleased as a starting point for this, and I think it's a strong kind of commitment from a number of individuals, and not dependent on just one or two, and I think that's a good thing. So we're on our way. That's all I have to say about that.
Okay, Nick. Thank you. How about FPAN? Any announcements? Robbie, are you there?
I am here. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yeah, we have a few things going on in April. We've been doing kind of a lot of our workshops on a monthly basis because they've been pretty popular, especially during quarantine, that people can do them from their living rooms. But we're having our crypt, which is our cemetery resource protection training, which really talks about protection in historical cemeteries. It's a 4-hour workshop from 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. on April 8th. And we do make an effort to make this as interactive as possible, even if we can't be in person. And we've had a request to do it on a Saturday as well. So we're actually doing two. We're doing another one on Saturday, April 17th, for those that need to work during the work week. So we'll have that Saturday offering. Then April 22nd, we're going to be doing our HMS Heritage Monitoring Scout workshop. That one is about 2 hours. And then on April 15th, we're going to be having a talk by our own Emma Dietrich on climate change and heritage at risk. So that will be at 7 p.m. on April 15th. And I'll type in the chat our website. So if you guys want to go on there, you can get more details and confirm the times and register and get more information. So I'll put that in the chat if you all want to just go onto our events page.
Okay. Thank you, Robbie. Catherine, are you on? Anything going on with the city? I didn't see her come on. Maybe she's not on yet. How about Mercedes with the county?
Hi, everyone. Mercedes Harold, Cultural Resources Coordinator. We do not have a lot of big announcements this week, but we did want to announce our St. Johns County 200th anniversary celebration website, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in the chat feature. Please check it out whenever you get a chance. There is an events page to show different events throughout the year for the 200th anniversary celebration. We had several great events in March, and so we were really happy to have St. Augustine Archaeological Association for several of the events. And that's all for today. Thanks.
Okay, fine, thank you. Catherine, if she's not on now, I know she'll probably be on later. Oh, she's just coming in the waiting room. Hang on a minute. Catherine, are you there? Okay, she'll be here in a minute. I know she just joined us, but one of the things that she'll be talking about is our famous Name the Artifact game. Let me share my screen and bring it up right now. I'll leave that up for a minute while Catherine's getting on board. Don't ask me what it is. I don't know either, but at the end of the lecture, we'll take some guesses. Okay, let me get rid of that and see if Catherine is on. Hang on, wait one.
Hi, Dawn.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Catherine, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
All righty. Are we talking about city announcements?
Yeah, we just showed the artifact, and I told them I didn't know what it was, but you do. So don't tell them now. We'll get that later. But you got any announcements from the city?
I do. So as of about an hour ago, the City of St. Augustine Archaeology Program now has its own Instagram page. If anybody's on Instagram, so we'll be sharing updates about our progress, projects we're working on, research that we're doing, outreach events that we're hosting. So if you want to follow us on Instagram, I'll type in the username in the comments. So feel free to share with your friends.
Okay, fine. Thank you. Let's get into the presentation. Tonight we have Nicole Grinnan. She's a maritime and public archaeologist who currently works for FPAN in the Northwest region of Florida, and that's out of the University of West Florida. Nicole received her bachelor's degree in both anthropology and history from the University of Central Florida. She has a master's degree in historical archaeology from the University of West Florida. And Nicole is currently working on a doctorate degree in the University of Birmingham. Not Birmingham, Alabama, Birmingham in the UK. And the doctorate dissertation is on Florida's underwater cultural heritage. Nicole is a registered professional archaeologist, a certified interpretive guide, and a scuba diver instructor. She serves on the board of directors on numerous associations, such as the Society of Historical Archaeology and the American Academy of Underwater Science. She's going to talk to us about Pensacola and try and convince us that Pensacola is older than St. Augustine, but we'll listen to Nicole and we'll see what she has to say. Let's see if we can get her on. Nicole, are you there?
Hi, Don. Thank you for having me.
It's all yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much to all of you for letting me cross enemy lines and presenting a little bit of the information that we have about the Don Tristan de Luna settlement attempt here in Pensacola, Florida. I'm really excited to talk about this with you all. And let me go ahead and just pull up the presentation. I will share my screen. Give me 1 second here while I wrangle all my screens. It's hard working with 3 screens at once. Come on. Let me do this instead. We've got 3 screens, which is useful when I'm working, but when I'm trying to pull up a presentation in a way that is useful to everyone, it's less. All right, let's see. Share screen, PowerPoint, sharing. Okay. Can everyone see my presentation slide? Should be the opening slide. Oh, thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yep, we see it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Sorry for that. Yeah, so like Don said, my name is Nicole Grinnan. I work with the Florida Public Archaeology Network in the Northwest Regional Center. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with FPAN over there in St. Augustine area. And I was asked to give a presentation that I actually recently gave to the Northeast region of FPAN. And I think the presentation was fairly well received, again, crossing enemy lines a little bit, but I think I had a few friendlies in the audience last time. And I think I do this time as well. So I'm excited to give this talk for you all as well. So kind of just as a preface before I get started, I just want to say that you know, this work is done by a much larger team of archaeologists than myself. I am not the principal investigator for this project, and I'm not a lead on this project, but I have been involved in a variety of ways over the last 11 years at this point. So I am involved with the work. I was able to kind of cut my teeth on the Luna shipwreck sites while I was doing my master's degree at the University of West Florida. And then I've been involved with a lot of the public archaeology and outreach and education projects involved with various aspects of the Luna expedition and reaching out to our community since. So I'm just one cog in the greater machine that is the University of West Florida and the Luna expedition. So just want to throw that out there. And I think even in our audience tonight, there are folks who are probably more experienced on the subject than I am, who actually did their master's work on the Luna site, which I did not do. I've just been working on it as a cog for the last few years. So just want to throw that out there before we begin. This presentation tonight is not meant to be comprehensive. It's not to provide every detail about Spanish colonization and all of the work that's been done on the 3 shipwreck sites and the land settlement sites that we've attributed to the Luna expedition. But it's meant to be a general overview. So if you do have questions about anything specifically or more broadly, feel free to use the chat function in Zoom to type those, and then I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. And if I don't know the answer, I will find the right person to answer your question and get back to you as soon as I can. So we're kind of taking a broad strokes here with this presentation. And so to start with, what I wanted to talk about was just the history and the background of the Luna expedition, just to provide kind of a place setting for why Spain decided to settle Pensacola in 1559. And so as many of you know, and I'm sure you're familiar with, the New World was really opening up in the 16th century. And Spain was kind of at the forefront of making inroads into North, Central, and South America. They were all over the place in the 16th century. And some of our first expeditions into Florida include the Juan Ponce de Leon expedition in 1513. We have Cortez going into interior Mexico in 1518. And meeting the Aztec along the way. We have other expeditions kind of along the Gulf Coast and Mexico by Narvaez a little bit later in the 1520s. We have Pizarro going into Peru and meeting the Inca and interacting successfully and not so successfully at time with the Inca there in the 1530s. We have Soto's very famous to us expedition into Florida and the Southeast in the kind of mid 16th century. We have Coronado exploring out west in the 1540s. And then by 1559, we have the Tristan da Luna expedition. And so a lot of changes happened over this period of time. Initially in the 16th century, what Spain was looking to do was put a stakehold in the New World and to exploit any good resources that they could find. Tristan da Luna was obviously not the first person to come to Florida and the southeast of the United States. The area had already been explored by Ponce de Leon and Soto before him. And so by the time we get to Tristan da Luna, the Spanish kind of knew that there were no very valuable resources in Florida. And so the reason why Luna eventually came to the area was for a very different reason. And so the idea was mostly strategic. Florida, if you're familiar with kind of ships and shipping and the maritime coastal routes around Florida, Florida is well placed in what was Spanish traffic, basically from the Old World to the New World and back and forth, bringing goods from Central and South America all the way back to Spain for sale. And so Florida was a strategic location. It was right along those routes, and many ships from Central America had to travel the Straits of Florida to get back to Spain. And so Florida was seen as a strategic location. We didn't have the gold, we didn't have the dyes and the really valuable spices and foodstuffs, but we were strategic. And so the thought was that if the Spanish were able to colonize La Florida, that the route back to Spain and between Central and South America and back to Spain would be assured as far as the Azores. And that was very important because there was a lot of money and goods going between those two places across the Atlantic in this time period. And so Spain really wanted to protect their holdings. And the quote that I posted here was by Don Luis de Velasco. Oops, let me go back here. Who was the viceroy of New Spain, essentially the representative of the king in the New World. And so who were the Spanish worried about at this time? Well, it was really the English and the French. The English and the French were a little bit later to the colonial party, as it were, but they were starting to make inroads in the 16th century. And the Spain wanted to make sure that Florida couldn't be used essentially as a launch point for French and Spanish privateers, or maybe otherwise funded English and French ships to attack their fleets. And so Florida was a strategic location, and could, if Spain put a foothold in Florida, it could establish a good buffer zone for the English, who were starting to incur from the north, and the French, who were coming down the Mississippi and incurring from the west. So Don Tristan de Luna was selected in 1557 to lead an expedition and become governor of Florida by establishing a settlement in a previously explored area called Ochuse. And this was around 1557. So fairly quickly after that, a fleet departed from Veracruz. So the viceroy established that they would leave from Veracruz in June of 1559. And you can see in the top left map here, yes, top left on your screen, that the route is kind of an interesting one. They kind of hugged the shelf of the Gulf of Mexico, going north and east. They were actually blown off course pretty significantly, almost all the way back to the Yucatan Peninsula and the Campeche banks, but then made their way north again, and then kind of bebopped along the coast of Northwest Florida, all the way over to Mobile Bay, which is just west of Florida. Realizing that Mobile Bay wasn't the bay that they wanted, came back to Pensacola and finally made their inroads in Pensacola. And why Pensacola Bay? I'll go into this a little bit more in a minute, but Pensacola Bay was seen as a much better place for a settlement for a variety of reasons, as opposed to Mobile Bay, which is very shallow and exposed. Mobile Bay, or Pensacola Bay rather, was a little bit more protected and better for large ships. And so what did Luna bring with him on this expedition? It was pretty extensive. There were 11 ships with the settlement intent. So it was a fleet of 11 ships. There were 540 soldiers and 240 horses on these ships. There were also 1,000 colonists. And this, of course, included women and children. The idea, again, was not to establish kind of a military outpost. This was meant to really create a settlement and create inroads into Florida, really build that Spanish foothold in the area. And so there were women and children. The idea was that this colony would grow over time. Interestingly, there were also other ethnicities and other races present on this expedition, often forcibly made to join the Spanish on this expedition. But these individuals included folks of African descent or Afro-Caribbean descent, and including some native Mexican groups as well, including some Aztec, which we see in the material culture. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And so when the Spanish came to Pensacola in 1559, the idea was to bring everything that they needed to establish the colony and for it to survive. And so Spain tended not to rely on the land to provide them what they needed. They liked to bring along the supplies that they wanted. So mostly food preferences were very strong with the Spanish. And so they brought with them everything that they thought they would need to eat and to really establish themselves. So this included corn, hardtack, bacon, dried beef, of course, the essentials like cheese, oil, wine, but they also brought with them architectural goods too, right? Arms, armor were needed, but also tools to build their settlement as well. And so here's an image of Don Luis de Velasco, again, the viceroy of New Spain, the king's representative in the New World. And this is a really interesting quote about Pensacola. He wrote to the king that Pensacola was one of the best ports that there is among what has been discovered in the Indies, and we know this from previous expeditions. The port is so secure that no wind can do the fleet or the ships any damage, right? It's famous last words. So shortly within a month after arriving in Pensacola in August, what we believe to be, maybe based on historical records, a Category 3, Category 4 hurricane hit Northwest Florida. And if you're familiar with Florida, you're familiar with Northwest Florida, you know this is not an uncommon event. And certainly the Spanish were aware of hurricanes and hurricane season, although, not maybe as aware of how they travel and their trajectories like we are today, but they were aware that there was a season of the year where the waters were more tempestuous and these major storms could pop up. So unfortunately, this is what afflicted the Luna expedition shortly after their arrival. We know from historical records there continued to be correspondence back and forth from the Viceroy and the Luna colony even after the storm. And we know from the correspondence about the toll of that hurricane that hit the expedition. And so we have a quote here from Tristan da Luna, again, based on historical records, that they lost on one of the ships which went aground a great part of their supplies. And what we had on land was damaged by heavy rains. And so if you think about it, the Luna colony, the Luna settlement had really only been in Pensacola for a short month or a little bit longer than a month. And so is that time to really build secure housing and secure warehouses for all of your supplies? No, not really. And so many of the supplies that the Luna settlement had brought with them to Pensacola were actually still being stored on the ships, which were just offshore of the area for the land settlement site. And unfortunately, when this hurricane came through, and we know how bad they can be in Florida, it drove those ships onto a sandbar and just kind of cracked their keels, and they spilled out their supplies. So there was a significant loss of life and supplies at this for the settlement after this storm. We know from historical records that 3 of the ships survived, and these ships actually made it out shortly before the hurricane. They were going back to Veracruz. 7 ships were sunk, and 1 ship was driven up on land, and historical records say that it was kind of splattered on land. By February 1560, many of the colonists traveled north to an Indian town called Nanapacana, which had been abandoned. And it had been abandoned, we believe, probably after the Soto expedition, was notoriously not friendly towards the people who were living in this area. Some of the men traveled further north into Georgia to the town of Coosa in search of food to ship back downriver. And it really kind of highlights the struggle of the expedition after this. They were not able to stay and survive in Pensacola, which was the location where they chose to establish their settlement. They really had to go into the interior to find food, find shelter, potentially find help to survive. So there were actually 4 maritime relief expeditions to resupply the devastated colony. But by April 1561, the remaining settlers and soldiers more or less lost faith in Luna, and he was replaced as governor. So Luna was on the outs shortly after the storm, within a couple of years. Some colonists were picked up by Angel de Villafañe, who was Luna's replacement, and they were taken to Havana kind of as an emergency, what's the word I'm looking for, to leave Pensacola because it was no longer viable. The 50 soldiers remained, but they were eventually moved by August of 1561. So we see fairly quickly that things devolve at this settlement and among the colonists. So, you know, they landed in September, or in August rather, of 1559, and by August of 1561, it was essentially completely abandoned. And so here's a really good map. This is from Dr. John Worth, who is an associate professor here at the University of West Florida and one of the principal investigators for the Luna land settlement site. And he has a fantastic website and blog with lots of good resources about the things that they find during the summer field schools and just his research in general. So he is a wealth of information, and I've stolen this map from him for this presentation, but kind of gives you an idea of the route of Luna and the kind of the timeline of what happened. So you can see that you can see their original route into Pensacola in 1559. Oops, they went to Mobile Bay. That's not a great place to go. And then back to Pensacola or Ochuse. And then you can see after the storm, traveling north through Alabama and all the way up into North Georgia, which is quite a walk for them to have done. And again, the hope was to find food, relief, support for a failing colony. So, upon failure of the Luna expedition, efforts were focused elsewhere, essentially, by the Spanish. Florida was still a really important strategic place. It was, you know, again, a place where they could protect their shipping, potentially, from the French and the English. And so we see efforts kind of shift over to the East Coast from the Gulf Coast, which, you know, if they're protecting shipping, I'm almost surprised they didn't focus on the Atlantic coast in the first place. But anyways, that's neither here nor there. We know that there were various inroads by the French into, you know, through Charles Fort Caroline into the 1560s, again, right after the failure of the Luna expedition. And then, of course, we have St. Augustine established in 1569 as a result of those inroads made by the French. So that is a very brief overview of the history. And again, not intended to be comprehensive. There's a lot more to all of that. In the historical records, the correspondence between the Luna expedition and the Viceroy, and then off to the King in Spain, they're really incredibly rich records. And there's so much there to kind of unpack. But that's just to kind of provide some context for talking about the archaeology of the Luna expedition. The next thing I really would like to talk about is the underwater archaeology. And this really is where I've been involved the most as far as outreach and education, and then also working on the site, doing active excavation as well. So this is probably where most of my knowledge resides as far as archaeology goes. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with underwater archaeology, but I always like to throw this slide in there because shipwrecks, and this I think is really highlighted in the juxtaposition of the Luna underwater sites and the Luna land settlement site. Underwater archaeology is kind of a different animal when we're talking about preservation and context. Shipwrecks, by their nature, are essentially like, when they wreck, they're almost like a photograph in time. When that ship wrecks, it goes underwater and the material that's on that wreck stays with it. Essentially, it's a closed context. Now the Luna, we do know from historical records that the Luna ships were salvaged to some degree for material. So not everything that went down with the wrecks is still there, but you know, a good deal of it is. And the interesting thing about the Luna sites as well is that there is excellent preservation. And again, we can really see this in contrast with the Luna land settlement site, which I'll highlight in a minute. So these are just some quick images of some artifacts that were found on the Luna site to show that excellent preservation. I'll talk a little bit more about them as we kind of move forward. But I will highlight here these rat bones. This is a really interesting find on the Emmanuel Point 1 shipwreck, which is kind of the name that we call the first Luna shipwreck that was found in 1992. And these are the bones of a black rat that were preserved, again, underwater for almost 450 years. So really incredible preservation. And so what's interesting also is that this is one of the first recorded remains of a black rat in what is now the United States. So along with oldest settlement, we can also get the prize of oldest black rat as well, which I don't know if as much as a prize. All right, so quick recap. The Luna expedition, the really first permanent European settlement attempt in what is now the continental United States. We had 11 vessels, 1,500 people coming with Luna. Those included soldiers and colonists, women and children, and folks who were enslaved or otherwise indentured and forced to come along. The hurricane struck the fleet, or the colony rather, in September of 1559. And fast forward a few hundred years, and we have the first discovery of one of the Luna shipwrecks in 1992 by the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research. A second vessel was discovered in 2006 on a project led by the University of West Florida. And a third vessel was discovered in 2016, again, by a project led by the University of West Florida. And then the image you see here is just a rendition of one of the Luna ships, the first shipwreck that was discovered. And this is actually just the design that was used for a Florida Archaeology Month poster, I believe in 2009. But a really nice drawing there nonetheless, and kind of showcasing some of the artifacts that were found on that site at the bottom. So let's talk about the first shipwreck that was discovered. Here is a map of Pensacola Bay, and I wait to talk about why the Spanish chose Pensacola Bay as a site until I get to this slide. So I mentioned that Mobile Bay, they turned around when they went to Mobile Bay. Mobile Bay is very open and very shallow. And so at least two of the ships coming with the Spanish were galleons, and these are very large draft vessels. They were carrying lots of supplies and animals and all of the things they needed to establish the settlement. And so it was not really a ship that you could get into Mobile Bay. And Mobile Bay, the area around it is very marshy. There's not a lot of highland, not a whole lot of fresh water. And so Mobile Bay was seen as, not an ideal place to land. So that's why the Spanish backtracked and came back to what had earlier been recorded as Ochuse and the Bay of Ochuse, or Santa Maria de Ochuse. And so Pensacola, as opposed to Mobile Bay, is a much deeper body of water. And so, there are parts of Pensacola Bay that get to 40, even 60 feet. And so the Spanish had the ability to get these fairly large vessels into Pensacola through this area down here. This is called Pensacola Pass, this very narrow opening between Santa Rosa Island and Perdido Key. So they could get these fairly large vessels in here and fairly close to land. What's interesting about the Pensacola Bay area as well is that if you hadn't just survived a hurricane, you would think it would be relatively well protected, right? You have land on all sides. You have not just a barrier island between you and the Gulf of Mexico, but you also have Gulf Breeze Peninsula. And so you would think that this would be a good place. It would be a good shelter from storms. You also have Bayou Tahar here, which is another fairly well-protected area. It's just a small bayou that runs north. And the Luna Land Settlement site, which I'll talk about in a minute, is kind of in this location. So this is where the settlers were. But of course, we know that hurricanes are very large and very damaging. And just because you're in a fairly well-protected or surrounded on all sides by land, that doesn't mean you're necessarily going to be protected by a storm. But that is one of the reasons why Pensacola Bay was selected. It had deep water, it had land on all sides. There were also high ground in this area here as well. And we call this area Manual Point. Today, it's known as the East Pensacola Heights neighborhood. But it's a fairly high land here, and so would have been a good place to establish the settlement. And honestly, today it's one of the more in-demand neighborhoods in modern Pensacola. There was also a freshwater spring in this area as well. So it's kind of checking all the boxes for a great place for a settlement to be. And so the first Emmanuel Point shipwreck was discovered just off of this landform in 1992. And this was a project led by the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research, their underwater archaeology team led by Dr. Roger Smith. And so his idea was actually to do an entire survey of the coast of Florida. And so he was going to start up here in Northwest Florida in the Pensacola Bay area, travel around the coast, around the Florida Keys, and then up the Atlantic coast and end up in Northeast Florida. And this would have been one of the very first coastal surveys of its kind, and all the more impressive because Florida has such a massive coastline. But they had started their survey in Pensacola and stopped when they found something significant. And that is what ended up being our first Luna shipwreck. So let's move forward here. If you're familiar with Pensacola, which some of you might be, you can see here, this is Bayou Tahar, this kind of waterway snaking north. This is the Emmanuel Point or East Pensacola Heights area. You can see a big sandbar in the water here, and then this little white thing. This is actually the University of West Florida research platform, which does work, allows students to work directly on top of the Luna shipwreck sites during the summer field school season. And then we also have our 3-mile bridge going south out to the Gulf Breeze Peninsula here. So these shipwrecks are in fairly shallow water. Of course, they wrecked against the sandbar, so they would be kind of shallow. But this is only about 12, 13 feet of water, which is not a lot. And it's incredible that there was so much preservation on these sites. And if you look at the map, really, you can see why there would be good preservation. Pensacola Bay really is the confluence of some major rivers, including the Yellow River, the Blackwater River, the Escambia River, and all of that silt and good dirty sediment travels downriver and essentially dumps out into Blackwater Bay, Escambia Bay, and then travels out Pensacola Bay out through Pensacola Pass. And kind of in the way are the Luna shipwreck sites right in this area. And so over time, all of the silt and sediment covered up these sites, preserving them for 450 years. So how was the first site found? This is kind of a crude representation of a marine magnetometer, but this is essentially how the first shipwreck site was found. Our research vessels are not quite this big, but what we essentially do is we tow a marine magnetometer behind our boats or our research vessels, and we look for interruptions in Earth's magnetic field. And when we see those interruptions on our computers or in our data, we know that there is something here that's very large and ferrous or magnetic. And usually these are large iron objects. Sometimes when we survey, those iron objects are washing machines. Sometimes they're 1559 shipwrecks. And so this, what I've got here on the left side of the screen is actually the printout from Dr. Roger Smith's survey, is working with the Florida Bureau of Archaeological Research, when they found the first Luna shipwreck. So today we have this all set up on computers. We don't actually have printouts from our marine magnetometers. But this actually is the one from 1992 showing, you kind of see this interruption in the data here, what ended up being an anchor from that first Luna shipwreck. And so here we just have a couple of images. Here's what that initial tool looked like that they were using. And then on the top, we have some of our University of West Florida students working with Dr. Gregory Cook, who is a principal investigator for the Luna shipwreck sites now. And they're working on surveying, doing further survey in the Pensacola Bay area, because we know that there was more than just one ship. So if you're interested in knowing what diving on an Emmanuel Point shipwreck, and again, we call them Emmanuel Point because that's the landform, and that's what they were called before we kind of decided, that they were the Luna shipwreck. So I refer to them as Emmanuel Point because that's what we call them generally here at the University of West Florida. If you were diving on the Emmanuel Point shipwreck, what would it look like? This is actually visibility on that shipwreck on a really good day. Pensacola Bay, again, lots of sediment coming out of those rivers to our north. So it's murky, but I often tell the students, it's like diving in a cup of tea, or a cup of coffee with grounds floating around. You can see to some degree underwater, but it can be dark and it can be kind of tinted green or brown. There are days when visibility is 6 inches in front of our face and we're essentially working by feel. There are days when we can see nothing on the site. So it really just depends. Our best visibility is always in the wintertime, which of course is when the bay is 55 degrees. But we do get a lot of good work in the winter when we can do it. And so here are just some quick pictures of artifacts that were found on this first Emmanuel Point shipwreck, including some olive pits. Again, excellent preservation. This is one of my favorite artifacts from the Emmanuel Point shipwrecks. This is essentially kind of a cutout or a profile of a Spanish galleon. And so you can kind of see, this would be the front of the ship and then the back of the ship, trying to keep my maritime terms out of this for the colloquial audience. But I think the real story behind this artifact is probably incredibly interesting, although we don't know what it is. Was this a toy that was made for a child that was brought along on this expedition? Was it, a loose plan for repair to the ship? Or was it just something that a sailor or a person on the ship carved out of sheer boredom while they were on board the vessel on their journey over? We don't know, but whatever that story is, I'm sure it is absolutely compelling. One of these kind of smoking gun artifacts found on the Luna expedition, or on this Emmanuel Point 1 shipwreck, was this pottery. And this is actually Aztec produced pottery. This was not made by the Spanish, by any of the African individuals. This was made by the Aztec individuals. And so we know from historical records that many Aztecs or Aztec were brought along to Pensacola as part of this expedition, generally as indentured kind of bodyguards for the expedition. But we don't have we don't have historical evidence of this for any other expeditions or kind of settlement attempts in Pensacola. And so when we found this associated with the Emmanuel Point shipwreck, it kind of let us know what we're looking at. There's really only one expedition that came to Pensacola with Aztec. And then there are those rat bones again. I always like to show those. They're quite small, quite fragile, and incredibly preserved for being as old as they are, and in as shallow water as they were in. And of course, there were other utilitarian items on these shipwrecks as well. We find a Spanish olive jar. We find kind of serving and food service and food preparation plates as well. Again, this fleet was, it was not a treasure fleet. It was not bringing goods back from the New World to the Old. It was a settlement ship. And so what we're seeing on these shipwrecks are the goods used in everyday life. And I just throw this drawing in. This is kind of a neat drawing that was done after the discovery of the first Emmanuel Point shipwreck. You can see what the site looks like underwater. These kind of little round things. I know it's hard to tell, it's kind of pixelated. These are the ballast stones that were in the bottom of the ship to help it, sail a little bit easier in the water, cut its way through the water, as it were. And here's some archaeologists working on excavating the site. And then laid on top of that is kind of an image of what the ship would have looked like back in 1559 before the hurricane. And then this little inset off to the left is what the shipwreck would have looked like after September of 1559. So that's the Emmanuel Point 1 shipwreck. We know that there was a second shipwreck, Emmanuel Point 2 shipwreck, discovered in 2006. So after a lot of the work was done on the first shipwreck, the University of West Florida, we knew based on historical records that there were more ships out there as part of this fleet that were wrecked during the storm. And so survey continued, mostly as a way to teach students, to teach them the processes of underwater archaeology. And so what we've got here is a map that was produced. The TGT little items on this map stand for targets. So I mentioned that when we do a magnetometer survey, essentially we look for little blips that indicate a disruption in Earth's magnetic field. And so what we do is then take those blips, we take the GPS coordinates for them and then plot them on a map and decide which ones, based on their size and based on their composition, which might be most likely to produce a shipwreck site or something worth investigating archaeologically. And so the first Emmanuel Point shipwreck is this EPS 50G right here. So you can kind of see it's on this sandbar off of the Emmanuel Point area or East Pensacola Heights. And we see some additional targets on this kind of sandy area as well. And we see target 17 here. And so when we're using survey equipment, it doesn't tell us what is underwater. It just tells us that there's something there that maybe we should go investigate. And so that's exactly what we do. We take those coordinates and we send divers down to go see what is actually there. And again, sometimes it might be a washing machine or a dryer or a toilet. I've found all of those things in Pensacola Bay. Cars that people have dumped in the water, we find those in Pensacola Bay. But in this particular case, it was a second Luna shipwreck. And so the second shipwreck is really where the University of West Florida has focused most of its student training activities since it was discovered in 2006. And so this is a great image of some of our students working on that research platform that you saw in the aerial photo. Students go out here sometimes during the winter field season, but mostly during the summer field season to kind of get familiar with diving, to learn the process of archaeology in a fairly shallow water environment, but also to work on an incredibly significant site. The Emmanuel Point shipwrecks are the second oldest shipwrecks in the United States, second to Padre Island, and the oldest shipwrecks in the state of Florida. So it is absolutely a significant site, even if we are often training students to work on them. They're doing important work. Some of the artifacts that have come off the second Emmanuel Point shipwreck include this really interesting leather shoe sole, a spoon, and spoons kind of have an interesting kind of maritime tradition. When you're on a ship, whether you're there as a sailor or as a colonist or an indentured servant or enslaved, you typically have your spoon that you're using for the duration of the ship. So it's really interesting that this was the spoon of a person at one point. And who that person was, we don't quite know, but we do still have their spoon. This was a really interesting artifact. It kind of looks like a Swiss Army knife, and that's essentially what it is. It's crafted out of ivory. And we think it's actually a manicure, maintenance, personal care tool. You see some little picks on there that could have been used for your fingernails or your teeth, for lice and other things in your hair. And what's interesting, it's actually, you can see that it's on a little bit of a swivel here, and that swivel does still work, which is really incredible. So really interesting artifact. that tells us a lot about, hygiene and maintenance of the personal body on these kinds of expeditions. It was still a priority. And then here's essentially, it looks like a cork, and that's essentially what it is. It's a little kind of bunghole plug for a barrel. But again, all of these things are very utilitarian, right? They're things that people brought with them to survive life in a new world, to start their life anew in a completely alien place. Mostly alien place. The Spanish had been there before, but these people hadn't. So we have a manual point 1 represented by that EPS. We have a manual point 2 represented by that target 17. And then, just by looking at this map, where would you expect the land settlement site to be? I know I've kind of already ruined that surprise, but if you knew that we had these shipwrecks, one discovered in 1992, one discovered in 2006, what would your best guess be about where that land settlement site was? And if you said this area, East Pensacola Heights, you would be right. Yeah, that's exactly where the land settlement site was eventually found. And, these shipwrecks are kind of clustered here for a reason, right? The ships were kind of coming in, they were anchoring them as close to the land settlement site as they could get. Again, these were fairly large ships, Emmanuel Point 1, Emmanuel Point 2. At least one of them we think was a Spanish galleon, so big ships, and which is why they're kind of still so far offshore here. But I mentioned that in 2016, another shipwreck was identified, and this one was actually a little bit closer to shore, and we call this one Emmanuel Point 3. We believe this to have been a much smaller vessel, maybe an Aviso or other kind of vessel that would have been sent between two ships, or just to run people to shore. More work is still being done on the site. Obviously, it was found much more recently than the other two shipwrecks, but it's a lot shallower, which to us indicates that it was probably a smaller vessel. So it was carried closer to the shore in the storm before it finally wrecked. So I don't have a lot of photos of that Emmanuel Point 3 shipwreck, but what I will say is that the visibility on this third shipwreck is actually much better than on the other two, because of all the sediment and silts coming out of the rivers to the north and kind of flowing out of Pensacola Bay. The other two sites, being fairly deeper, often are the resting place for a lot of that sand and sediment. Because of the location of this third shipwreck site being close to shore, it's in more of a sandy area. And so that actually means that there's a lot less particulate in the water to get kicked up. And so the site actually has much better visibility. And so we get some really good snaps like this one from that shipwreck site. So here you can see two University of West Florida students working on excavating a unit that's laid out underwater, kind of bounded by this material. You can see underneath, so she's writing on her clipboard here, but you can see underneath her hand some of the timbers from that third shipwreck still in place and articulated. So there's some integrity to the timbers that we find on these sites. And so what they're doing is actually probably marking the ending spot for their excavation of this unit by measuring how deep they've excavated and then plotting it on a map. So this gives you a good idea of what working underwater on these sites look like. And if the visibility was this good in this photo, imagine what it's like working on these shipwreck sites when you can only see, 6 inches in front of your face, or sometimes nothing at all. So we'll talk real quick about the terrestrial archaeology. Again, most of my experience was with the underwater archaeological sites. My experience with the terrestrial archaeology has been more on the public outreach and education side. But, here at UWF, we're all one big family. So I'm happy to share some of the information that has come out of recent excavations on the terrestrial side. So how was the land settlement site discovered? It's kind of an interesting story. The site was actually first reported to the University of West Florida in October of 2015. The site was discovered essentially by, I'm not going to say amateur archaeologists, because this individual had taken archaeology classes actually with Dr. Judy Bentz, who is the board chair of FPAN, former president of the University of West Florida, and really the founder of public archaeology and archaeology really in the city of Pensacola in Northwest Florida. He had taken classes from her and recognized that some artifacts that he saw on the ground in a neighborhood where he was walking were significant. And so he brought those to the University of West Florida, and they were tentatively identified as very significant. And so you have a good quote here from Dr. John Worth. when he said that what we saw in front of us in the lab that day was an amazing assemblage of mid-16th century Spanish colonial period artifacts. And really, based on our knowledge of historical records, there's only one way those artifacts could have gotten to Pensacola. So it was a good indicator that something significant was afoot. And so this image that you see here was from our press release. I don't know how I made it so close to the front of this long list of very important people. I probably should be over here somewhere. But there I am. And then the person speaking at the podium is Dr. Elizabeth Benchley, who is the director of the Archaeology Institute here at the University of West Florida, also one of the principal investigators for the Luna Project. And Dr. John Worth is right here behind her. And next to him is Dr. Judy Bentz. So again, the site was first reported in 2015. The site, or what we thought would be the site at that time, is actually located in a neighborhood, East Pensacola Heights, like I mentioned before. And this is a really nice neighborhood in Pensacola. Again, it's on high ground, has a beautiful view over Pensacola Bay. So very nice homes in this area. And fortunately, you know, and as a result of a lot of work, the university really courted good relationships with people in that community. And so after talking with them about the significance of the site and the work that could be done, permission was given from a lot of the landowners to start conducting shovel tests in their yards. And so that is what started in shortly after the discovery in October 2015. And so since then, there's been a great deal of effort to kind of go where we can in that neighborhood, kind of at the goodwill of the community and the people living there, to do our summer field schools. And the community has largely been really receptive to this. There were a lot of public outreach efforts to kind of talk to them about the significance of the site and about why archaeology is so important to Pensacola, Northwest Florida, the United States. We can keep getting bigger, the Atlantic world. But I think, you know, the community, they're interested. They want to see this kind of work done. And I think they like the title of having the oldest neighborhood in the continental United States, which they have now adopted as their own, that title. So a lot of good work has been conducted in this neighborhood with the permission of the landowners. And so let's see, let's go forward here. So this is the landform again. So this is East Pensacola Heights. This waterway coming north is Bayou Tahar. Just offshore here are the shipwreck sites. They're actually kind of down over this way. And then this is East Pensacola Heights right here. It's a beautiful area. Here is a photo from one of the outreach and education programs that we did. Some of the neighbors were interested in getting their kids out to help participate and learn about the archaeology. And so we sponsored days for kids and grandkids to come out and learn a little bit about the archaeology that was literally being done in their parents' or grandparents' backyard. So a lot of really good kind of community goodwill has come out of this project. Some of the artifacts that were discovered on the site, again, very significant and unique to this time period. They look very different than the artifacts that we find on the maritime sites or the underwater sites. And again, this is, I'm gonna honk the horn of maritime archaeology again, but the preservation is just so much better underwater. On land, this is an area that people have been living in for hundreds of years. East Pensacola Heights has been popular. It has always been popular. And even though, you know, the Spanish abandoned the area in 1561, the Spanish came back in 1698 and kind of spread out again through various iterations of the city of Pensacola. And so this area has always been a place where people want to be because of the resources, because of the high ground, because of the close anchorage just offshore in the sandbar. So all that to say, the integrity, the archaeological integrity of this area is not as great, right? There have been people living in this area for a very long time. And so even the teeny tiniest artifacts can tell us something, absolutely, but they're just far fewer of them and not as well preserved. But, you know, archaeology is not just about the artifacts. It's also about looking at the soil for features and other things in the ground, which have yielded quite a bit of information. And we'll talk about those more in a minute. And so we find on the land settlement site a lot of similar things that we find on the underwater sites. We find ceramics. We could do the kind of catch-all Tupperware ceramics like olive jar, but also kind of servingware or food service ceramics like the red glazed earthenware. Again, all kind of pointing to this early Spanish period. Oh, here we go. Here's some olive jar, some of that servingware, the Columbia Plain up here on the top. We talked about the Aztec pottery we found on the shipwreck and how that's kind of a smoking gun indicator that we had Luna shipwrecks. Well, the same is for underwater or on land as well. We found similar Aztec pottery. Again, preservation not as good, but definitely identifiable and diagnostic or easily identified or analyzed. So yes, there is a correlation between these two sites, and finding this Aztec pottery was a good indicator indeed of the Luna expedition and the relationship of the underwater and the land terrestrial sites. And again, a good quote from Dr. Worth here again, the one thing that the Luna expedition had that no other Spanish expedition had throughout the entire history of Spanish Florida is the presence of these Aztec individuals and their material culture. Other artifacts include metals. We don't find as many of these underwater. Preservation of metal and iron artifacts is often not as good underwater. So there's we can put a check in the terrestrial box there. But some of these artifacts found on land include lead line weights that were, would have been repurposed from the ship's sheathing on the outside of the vessel to protect it from marine worms in warm water of the Gulf of Mexico. Repurposed probably for fishing nets or for fishing line. Copper bells, copper rosettes would have been kind of decorative pieces going onto the fasteners on helmets and breastplates. An aglet, which is this artifact right here. We all have aglets on our sneakers these days. They're just made out of plastic. They help us thread our shoelaces through the holes. This one is metal and from the 16th century, but the same thing. We also find a lot of fasteners that would have been needed for architectural purposes, whether on the ships or on land when building the settlement. We also find these interesting carrot-headed nails, which are another unique artifact and only found on Spanish sites in the Southwest during this similar time period during the Coronado expedition. So some interesting correlations there. We also found some interesting trade goods and glass beads. These beads have kind of been the figurehead for the artifacts found on the Luna land settlement site because they are so beautiful. But glass beads like these would have been personal goods or brought for trade. There weren't any Indian or Native American groups in the area when the Spanish came to Pensacola in 1559. They had largely abandoned the area before, and we think possibly as a result of the Soto expedition and kind of the reverberation of that throughout the Southeast and the Mississippian world. But again, not all about the artifacts, not all about that. And sometimes the preservation of features or things we can't really move and take with us as archaeologists are even more telling than the artifacts. So this image here is the profile of a burned Spanish post. You can see that right here. You can kind of see some of that dark, really organic looking burn matter here, showing some olive jar sherds that were packed vertically along the post hole walls. Some of these olive jar sherds actually cross-mended with sherds in the artifact-rich layer above that post hole. And so there's speculation that this building was constructed and burned after the 1559 hurricane, which that hypothesis is largely supported by radiocarbon dates of the carbonized wood in the post hole. So all pointing kind of to that Luna area. But because the artifacts cross-mend with artifacts in the top layer, it's thought that perhaps there was a reason they were put into this post hole, and perhaps that was after the hurricane. And this was the work of one of the students done under Dr. Worth at UWF. Here's another really cool, interesting feature. This was a large trash pit with 16th century trash, things like broken barrel bands, which you can kind of pick out really easily there. Spanish pottery sherds, we have nails, we have spikes, some wire, smashed Native American bowl ceramic, some shell, and a complete deer antler. So certainly they were hunting a little bit as they came to Pensacola. And then some mechanical stripping of topsoil in advance of house construction in the neighborhood. Again, a lot of what we're doing is kind of salvage ahead of the building of garden beds or putting in pools or building new houses. But this kind of mechanical stripping exposed a fire pit deposit that contained some Spanish olive jar sherds and a wrought iron nail fragment, some shell, wood, charcoal. And you can see this kind of fire pit deposit. This is a plan view here looking down, and then a profile view here. You can see some of that shell that's in there pretty clearly. So some interesting features are still preserved despite being so much later in time and despite being in a really popular neighborhood. So these remains, when carefully excavated and done through the archaeological process, are still there and still able to tell us a great deal about what was going on with the Luna expedition when they came here initially in August of 1559 and what happened after the hurricane of September 1559. And so what's interesting is that there is, based on the historical records, we see the archaeology largely reflects that they indeed established a settlement like they planned before they came here. And so this is another great map by Dr. John Worth showing the 27-acre Luna settlement site, kind of a projection of what we see archaeologically, but it also shows you other activity areas, the landing for the boats that were going back and forth to the ships where many of the supplies still were, and the freshwater spring, and then the kind of the walk down to Bayou Tahar, where it was easy to access lots of good maritime resources like shellfish, or to travel further north for hunting purposes. And so what's interesting is that now we have our archaeological data revealing Luna settlement size to be somewhere between 12.7 and 14.8 hectares, about, again, that 27-acre area. And we can confirm, and here, again, I'll kind of tout Pensacola. This is by far the largest 15th century Spanish residential site in the entire southeastern United States. So that's larger than both 16th century locations of St. Augustine, which were about 1 and 4 hectares, and the contemporaneous location of Santa Elena in South Carolina, which is about 6 hectares. So this was orders of degree larger than those settlements. So maybe we didn't last since 1565, but we were ambitious. We were very ambitious to start. Since the Luna expedition or settlement originally housed 1,500 settlers, that was more than double the number of settlers living in 16th century St. Augustine and Santa Elena, which had about 300 to 600 inhabitants in each. But the 2-year duration, of course, was far shorter than later Spanish colonies to the east, like St. Augustine. So it did leave a lighter trace on the landscape, again, because they weren't there very long. And as far as archaeology goes, all of the work that's been done on the underwater sites since 1992 and the land sites since 2015, it's really only the beginning. There is so much more to learn about the lives of the people that traveled on this expedition, why they made the decisions to come to Pensacola, what life would have been like as far as survival following the hurricane in September of 1559, and why various choices were made to travel north to essentially evict Luna as governor, and then eventually to abandon the effort as well. So there's a lot more to learn in the artifacts, and especially as we correlate them with some of the really interesting historical documents as well. And, you know, what I like to kind of emphasize too is that the artifacts are really neat. We like to focus on the artifacts a lot, but what we're really looking for here when we do archaeology is the story, right? The story of human history. And in this case, the story of human survival against significant odds. And so we like to be good advocates for the protection and preservation of archaeology in our community. And St. Augustine has done an outstanding job with this. Pensacola could learn a lot from St. Augustine in this regard. But I always like to, encourage folks to be active and vocal about archaeology. And I'm probably preaching to the choir a little bit with this group, but, talk to your city councils, your county commissions, tell them you care about your community heritage. And, again, St. Augustine has great ordinances for archaeology, but not all of our communities in Florida do. So there's a lot of good work to be done there as well, being activists in our community and advocates for heritage and archaeology. And then I'll just do a quick plug for FPAN's Northwest region. If you don't follow us on Facebook, you should. Where you can find us at FPAN Northwest. We do talks called Zoom into Archaeology every Thursday at 3:30 p.m. Central or 4:30 p.m. Eastern. And we feature archaeology from all over the state. Actually, this week on Thursday, we're featuring Emily Jane Murray from the FPAN Northeast office talking about ancient fermentation. And then on April 22nd, we're going to be joined by Kyle Lent from SEARCH, Southeastern Archaeological Research, and he's going to talk a little bit about the Maple Leaf site, which is in the St. Johns River, another really cool underwater archaeological site. So if you're interested in more of these talks, we have lots of them going on. You can find more information about them on our Facebook page or on our website. And we also upload all of our content on YouTube. So you can visit old presentations there as well. Just search for Florida Public Archaeology Network. And that is the end of my presentation for this evening. I am happy to take any questions. Don, I don't know if you have more business that you need to do. Feel free to do that. Let me stop sharing my screen.
We have a couple of things we'll talk about at the end, but you know, if there's any questions, use that chat, or you can unmute yourself if you want to do that.
Let me go ahead, close that. All right. See, I see one question, and this is one, unfortunately, I can't answer, but we have lots of St. Augustine folks in the room here. Did Aztec participate in the building of the Castillo in St. Augustine? That I don't know. I know that the Aztec presence was unique in the 16th century to Pensacola. They weren't, you know, with Menendez, but I don't know about the building of the Castillo. I'm thinking probably not, but again, not the expert in St. Augustine.
This is Tony Wallace. I think I have heard that there were Aztec workmen who, and I don't have any citations, but I have heard that there were Aztecs here in St. Augustine participating in the construction of the Castillo.
Yeah, that might be one we have to research and double back on. Happy to do that.
I'd just like to congratulate Dr. Grinnan on such a high protein delivery, where you hit so many subjects in a lively way. You stuffed the most I think anybody could stuff into, you know, such a short compass of time. So congratulations on that.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. It really, you know, we could talk for hours about any particular aspect. We could talk for hours about one shipwreck. So it is really hard to boil it all down into one presentation, but hopefully I hit the high points.
You sure did.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well, I want to thank you, Nicole. That was a very interesting talk. I'm sure we all appreciate it, and we have a better understanding of the Spanish history before St. Augustine.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Let me just go on to one other item here. The FAS, which is really the state organization for anthropology and archaeology, they run a conference every year. Some of you probably remember St. Augustine hosted the conference probably about 8 or 9 years ago. With the pandemic, they did not run one last year. This year they're running it, but it's going to be virtual. And the dates are the 21st to the 23rd. As more details come out, we'll distribute those to the membership on the email list that we do have. But I just wanted to give you a heads up on the date. And I believe we'll probably be hosting that conference in the next couple of years as well. So something to look forward to. And let me at this point bring up that name the artifact.
Thank you. Thank you for not letting me feel alone and silly, you know.
I went, rather failing, yes.
I think it's a chocolate stirrer.
I was gonna say a pestle, like for grinding.
Yes, it does look like a pestle.
Was it? Oh, yeah.
But I was wondering if it has something to do with the lip thing where it would hold it up, where you would only go part way in or something like that. Like I have spoons that kind of hook on a pan or something. I was wondering if that's relevant, that it has the extra.
That's why I think it's a chocolate stirrer.
Oh.
Any other late entries here?
So maybe. If it were
Catherine, can you
larger,
fill us in as to what's going on here?
I can. I will not keep you in suspense any longer. And I will say, you guys aren't totally far off. Do you have the next slide, Don? That you can
You know, I don't know if I can bring the other one up here. I'll see. Wait one.
Well, while he's looking for that, it is an enema pump nozzle.
Ah!
Oh my gosh.
And the reason why this is this month's featured artifact is because a similar one with the same function was actually found on the Luna settlement site. So there it is there, that second picture, that one on the bottom is also an enema pump nozzle. So it's a very intimate artifact. It's not something we see very often. For those of you who may not know, enemas were used for cleaning and flushing out lower bowels and colons. Usually it's a nozzle attached to a kind of a bladder, so either an animal bladder or a bag or a leather bag that would have been filled with either water or medicinal mixtures, herbal mixtures to try to cure all kinds of ailments that back in the day ranged from legitimate gastrointestinal issues to dysentery to digestive problems, but also things like a headache and the flu and nausea and just all kinds of other unrelated problems. Enemas themselves, they date back to ancient Egypt, so they've been around a really long time.
What are they made out of?
So the one that's on the top, it dates to this 19th century, and it's made out of a rubber. So it's unfortunately broken, which you can't really tell in the photo. And the one on the bottom is made out of a cupreous material, some kind of mixture of copper. But that one was found on the terrestrial settlement of the Luna site.
Catherine,
Yes.
when I was growing up, my mother had an enema bag, and yes, it had a white pump just like that. And the doctor that prescribed that, his first words were, whatever was wrong with us, give them an enema. And it did cure when one of the children started throwing up. So now that you said it, I totally recognize it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
Me too.
That the Maya used enemas for hallucinogenics.
Oh, it's possible.
Yeah,
I don't know about
Other
that.
uses.
I've heard that. I've heard
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that's done in some cultures. It's a fast way to get it into the system, into the mucous membranes, kind of like snorting things, goes into your system quickly.
One end to the other.
Yeah.
So you guys were close. Some of you were kind of close.
Except for the chocolate.
Well,
With
thanks
that,
for
I can't
guessing.
wait to next month's artifact. Speaking of next month, that meeting is going to be on the 4th of May. And we're going to have Chuck Mead and Sarah from FPAN. So Chuck is going to talk about what LAMP has been doing, and Sarah Miller is going to be talking about what FPAN in St. Augustine has been doing for the last year. So if there are no other questions, we'll call it closed, and we'll see you all next month. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.